Last year, I made a video comparing the iPhone 13 with the 13 Pro, and asked the question, do you actually need the Pro? After comparing the phones side by side and highlighting all the differences, we reached the conclusion that for most people, the answer is no. But this year, things are different. There's clearly a much bigger gap between the 14 and 14 Pro series, plus there's been a huge price hike for all of the phones across Europe and other parts of the world, so the question now becomes a lot more interesting and perhaps more difficult to answer. It used to be the case that in order to get a big iPhone, you had to pay extra for a Pro Max, but with Apple introducing a plus-sized iPhone 14, you can now get a big iPhone without the Pro price tag. I've already made videos comparing all of the new 14 series phones with last year's models. I'll leave those links down in the video description if you want to check those out. This video is going to compare the iPhone 14 Plus against the Pro Max, and since the smaller versions of these phones are essentially the same, most of the comparisons will apply to those phones as well. So let's take a look at Apple's latest iPhones and ask the question, do you need the Pro now? First of all, can we discuss how ridiculous it is that Apple uses both Plus and Max to mean big for their iPhones? I mean, I guess Apple wanted to go back to using the word Plus like they did with the 7 and 8 Plus years ago, and probably wanted to do the same with the Pro series, but then they'd have a phone called Pro Plus, so that's why we have this mess we're in today. Anyway, this is how the phones stack up in terms of size. There's basically nothing in it, but the weight is definitely something you'll notice. The 14 Plus is considerably lighter and therefore more comfortable to hold, and doesn't feel as top heavy either. It's the same deal with the smaller phones as well, and quite refreshing to use the lighter 14 and 14 Plus. Part of the reason for this is the aluminium frame versus the stainless steel Pro frame, so the Pros still have this slight edge for durability. Both phones have ceramic shield glass and the same IP68 water resistance though, so there's really not much in it. The bigger difference is in their appearance, and does anyone else think the regular iPhones just look nicer than the Pros? The dual camera layout and thinner bump looks so much better to me, especially since the glossy Pros are fingerprint magnets. I must say that I love the matte textured glass on the Pros though, especially in space black, but pretty much all of this becomes irrelevant if you use a phone case. You then have essentially the same drop protection, it covers up the sides and back of the phone, and you'll only see the screen and the camera bump. It's all well and good picking out a lovely matte finish Pro iPhone, but really you should be choosing the design based on how the camera cutout looks, since this is the part you'll actually see. If you're brave enough to go caseless though, the Pros do look and feel like more premium devices. Of course, a big part of the design is in the display, and the Pros obviously have an advantage here which we'll come onto, but just in terms of the aesthetics, I think this might actually divide opinion. I personally think the Pro cutout looks better. It's more modern with the separation from the top bezel, and to be honest, I'm just a bit sick of the older notch design since we've had it for so many years. The fact that it can dynamically change in size and appearance also helps to disguise it as a software element on the screen, as opposed to just cutting into your display area. There are some who find the new cutout more distracting, especially in landscape for things like gaming and movies, but to be honest, like the older notch, it's just something you get used to and eventually stop noticing. The Pros easily win for the display quality though. They're not only brighter, with an industry-leading peak of 2000 nits compared to 1200, but they're faster too with their 120Hz ProMotion tech. Now, the numbers would suggest a huge difference in brightness, but that's not actually the case in real-world use. Neither phone will spend much time at its true peak brightness, and there's actually not much of a difference under typical use. It's mainly outdoors in bright sunlight where the Pros have an advantage. The biggest difference is the Pro's high refresh rate. That is something worth paying extra for. I've spoken many times about how smooth the 60Hz iPhones are, but it simply doesn't compare to how slick and fluid ProMotion feels. And to be honest, it's about time Apple gave all of their iPhones ProMotion. The thing is though that people who aren't used to it will typically say that they don't notice much of a difference, and I'll admit it can be subtle at first. But once you've used ProMotion for a while and have adjusted to it, you'll never want to go back to a low refresh rate display again. It's kind of like when HD TVs came around. People said, yeah, I guess this looks a bit better. We became used to it, and then suddenly you switch back to non-HD and it's like, oh god, this is horrendous. So, people with a 60Hz phone already, an older iPhone perhaps, if you don't find your display is slow and choppy now, you'll be absolutely fine with an iPhone 14 or 14 Plus. They're bright, sharp, and have excellent colours. But if you're used to a high refresh rate already, you'll definitely want to spend extra for a Pro instead. Dynamic Island is another big part of the display differences, and a reason to specifically get a 14 Pro. It adds an extra layer of functionality to the phone which is not only practical, but makes the experience feel new and different as well. iPhones are notoriously bad at multitasking, but Dynamic Island allows you to do this, plus you can have a little bit of fun with it as well. Is it essential? No. But is it a cool, useful extra feature? Absolutely. And finally, the Pros also have an always-on option, so the screen stays lit when locked to show your lock screen info at a glance. For some people, especially those coming from Android phones, this is a must-have feature. For others, it's basically useless, especially with how easy it is to wake the screen with a simple tap or picking the phone up. It also tanks your battery life, despite Apple's numerous smart battery saving attempts, so much so that I've ended up turning the feature off on my 14 Pro. So I personally don't rate this feature too highly, but it is exclusive to the Pro iPhones. Don't forget that the phones are now the same size as well, so whether you want the smaller 6.1-inch screen size or the big 6.7 inches, you don't have to pay for a Pro to get it. Lots of people specifically want a big screen iPhone, and previously you had to buy a Pro Max to get it. Now you can get it in the cheaper 14 Plus, which is perfect for those of you who don't care much about the extra Pro features, but still want to enjoy your content on the big screen. So let's talk performance now, which until this year used to be essentially identical. However, Apple didn't upgrade the iPhone 14 to the latest A16 Bionic chip, which the Pros got. They instead have the A15 from the 13 Pro. So this is how the two chips compare in the benchmark tests, and you'll see that it's mainly with the graphics performance that the A16 pulls ahead. So you'll see a few more frames per second when gaming, and the Plus does seem to run hotter as well, but the overall gains aren't actually that substantial this year. The 14s were upgraded to match the Pro's 6GB of RAM, so that's helped to close the gap as well. But I think the important thing to remember is that these numbers on paper really don't mean much. With normal everyday use, are you actually going to notice the difference in performance? Would you even notice if the Pros had the A15 chip instead? I think almost no one would. The two chipsets are so similar and both super powerful that they'll easily handle pretty much everything you'll throw at them. The type of person to care about the tiny gains the A16 might give you is already going to get a Pro anyway, and if you're not sure, you definitely don't need to spend extra on the Pro just for the performance. Gamers should also consider firstly the size, whether you want the smaller 6.1-inch screen that might be easier to hold and use whilst gaming, or the bigger 6.7 inches that gives you a wider field of view and a better movie viewing experience. So that could be with either the Pro or the non-Pro, but if you'll want a game with a high refresh rate, you'll have to get one of the Pro iPhones. All 14 series phones get upgrades like Bluetooth 5.3, the new crash detection, and emergency SOS via satellite, plus they're both running iOS 16, so the experience and capabilities are very similar. Only the Pros get a 1TB storage option though. The 14s max out at 512GB, so if you need the maximum storage available, then you'll have to go for a Pro. The other aspect of performance to consider is the battery life, and Apple claim that it's the 14 Plus that has the best battery life ever on an iPhone, not the Pro Max. However, they also list the Pro Max as having the best video playback performance. But then we also know that the always-on display tanks the battery life. So which phone actually has the best battery? Well, I first tried a lab test, setting the phones to identical brightness and playing the exact same videos on a continuous loop, and sure enough the Pro Max does last slightly longer. But this isn't realistic. No one actually watches videos and nothing else for an entire day. So I set the phones up with identical settings, receiving the exact same notifications, and used the default display settings. So that's with auto brightness, pro motion, and the always on display turned on. I used the phones identically, spending time browsing social media, making calls, gaming, using the camera, and of course keeping them in standby. A whole variety in case these affected the battery life differently. And it does. For instance, the Pro Max drains slightly quicker using the camera, so that's likely due to the greater amount of processing it requires. But then it lasts longer with videos, perhaps because the refresh rate is able to drop down lower than on the Plus. Anyway, I ended the day with the Pro Max having 4% battery remaining when the Plus finally died, which equated to around 20 minutes of use, so I was pretty surprised to find that actually the Pro Max is the real battery champ. And remember, you can extend this even further by turning off the always-on display. Don't get me wrong, the Plus's battery life is excellent, and these two both last significantly longer than the smaller phones. You can get a couple of extra hours of screen on time at least, but I don't actually think the Plus has the longest battery life as Apple claim. The crown still belongs to the Pro Max, but only just. Low-key though, the best battery update with the Pros is this greatly improved low battery notification that pops up from the dynamic island, so you're no longer held hostage until you dismiss it like you are on every other iPhone. As for charging, there's basically nothing in it. They can all use Lightning, MagSafe and wireless charging, and the charging speeds are basically identical. It's interesting that the smaller phones charge in roughly the same time as the bigger battery iPhones, and all can reach 50% charge in less than half an hour. In order to do this though, you're going to need a fast charger, and if you watch my other videos you'll know that I recommend Anker's Nano 3. It's super small and compact, and yet can still charge all of the new iPhones at their maximum speed. It comes in multiple colours and is much cheaper than Apple's version, so it's kind of a no-brainer. There are some great bio-based charging cables that you can pair these up with too. They also come in multiple colours, sizes, and most importantly, are better for the environment. So I'll leave links to both of these down in the video description if you want to check those out. There's one area where the Pro Max has an obvious advantage, and that's the camera. If you want the best camera experience possible, you have to get a Pro. That much is obvious given that the Pros have a telephoto lens where the 14 and Plus don't, but there's far less of a difference with the ultra-wide and main lenses than you might expect. So this is how the two compare side by side, and you'll see that aside from the 14 cropping in more, there's almost nothing to distinguish them. We already saw that the cameras are barely different from last year's phones, but here we've got the same photonic engine as well, so this result really isn't surprising. I think a lot of people would have expected the Pros with their 48 megapixel main lenses to be noticeably better, but remember that by default the phones take 12 megapixel photos just like the 14 and 14 Plus. High-res 48 megapixel photos are enabled in a separate mode by toggling on Pro RAW, and we saw in the Pro review that this was absolutely necessary if you want to see any real improvement with the Pro's camera. But we also saw the drawbacks of this. Firstly, that you still need to crop in quite a lot to actually spot the improvement. This is cropped in 5 times, and the Pro's image is clearly higher resolution and less noisy. But since this is a RAW image, it also doesn't have the brightened highlights and added contrast that the 14 Plus has. You can see that in the plaque at the bottom. So the Pro RAW image, as with any RAW photo, could do with some editing to match that and realise its full potential. There's no doubt that 48 megapixel Pro RAW photos are much higher quality, arguably the best on the market right now. But if you're just looking at the photos on a small screen like your phone, you probably still won't notice the benefit. Secondly, it takes a lot longer to process those higher res photos, so you get more shutter lag, and the experience really changes from the convenient point and shoot you get with a 14 or with Pro RAW turned off. And finally, you'll also have to deal with exceptionally large file sizes. The regular shot here is just 2.3 megabytes versus the 84 megabyte Pro RAW shot, almost 40 times bigger. And again, at first glance, can you tell which is which? So you'll quickly eat into your phone's storage shooting in Pro RAW, and these 3 drawbacks combined mean that the Pros don't just offer an instant, simple improvement with the camera. Certainly average users who aren't super into photography need to bear this in mind, because it's easy to get distracted by that lovely 48 megapixel spec on paper, but things are a bit more complicated with real-world use. Now with the ultra-wide lens, the key difference is that the Pros offer macro mode, so if you like super close-up photography, you can only do this with a Pro iPhone. The ultra-wide lens specs are very similar, but I'd actually say that the 14 Plus shots look better because of the colour accuracy. I mentioned that green tint with the ultra-wide on the Pros, which you can see here affecting the sky especially, but the 14 Plus photo is closer to what I saw in real life. So until Apple fixes the Pro's processing, I actually prefer the ultra-wide on the 14. Sometimes I would see slightly better HDR with the Pro, which is interesting because I would have thought the image processing with Smart HDR4 would be more similar. But I saw this on other lenses too, like the main lens here with this portrait shot. Portraits otherwise are quite similar on the main lens, and both offer an accurate cutout and a nice blurred background. But the Pro can also take portraits with the new 2x zoom, or on its telephoto lens at 3x. So not only do you get more options with the focal length, but the quality of the portraits is really great with these lenses. The Pro is definitely superior with portrait mode. The telephoto lens is the biggest factor separating these two cameras, and the Pro can not only zoom up to a much higher level of 15x compared to 5x, but the quality of those zoomed photos is far superior. The further you zoom, the more you'll see the difference, and it highlights how useful it is having a dedicated telephoto lens that can optically zoom. This year the Pros also have a 2x optical zoom, which we saw in the Pro review gives a subtle but nice improvement over previous iPhones. But we've also seen how the digital zoom on this year's iPhone 14 is much better, and interestingly when comparing the two, you can see how this closes the gap a little on the Pro models. I often saw the 14 keeping up with the Pro at 3 and even 5x zoom, and again it's a case of having to crop in to spot the differences. These 3x shots also appear to be quite similar, so it won't matter if you're just going to stick these on Instagram, but cropping in closer, you can then start to see the benefit of the Pro's optical zoom. Still, if you'll be taking lots of portrait and zoom shots, especially at those higher zoom levels, you'll definitely benefit from the Pro's telephoto lens. But if you'll typically use the main lens, and only the occasional zoom at 2 or 3x, the 14 and 14 Plus should be plenty good enough. With low light things are interesting because the 14 Pro has a new larger sensor that's supposed to deliver the best low light performance yet, and this will sometimes result in brighter photos like this. But the 14 has a wide aperture main lens to counter this, and most of the time will show very similar performance to the Pro, even able to focus here for this portrait shot without the Pro's LiDAR sensor. The main difference is when the phones will activate night mode. So here the 14 Plus has taken a longer exposure, which results in that brighter blue sky, whereas the Pro didn't activate night mode because the sensor picked up sufficient light not to, which results in a darker but more realistic image. I saw this on the ultra-wide as well, and you can perhaps see the Plus shot is a bit more noisy and has more motion blur. So where the Pro loses out in the daytime with the colours, it brings a subtle improvement at night thanks to the new sensors. In general though, you won't see any massive difference with the regular photo mode. You have to crop in quite a lot to spot the slight improvement the Pro's camera can give you. That is until you enable the 48 megapixel Pro RAW mode, at which point the difference becomes much more obvious. So just like in the daytime, if you want to see a big improvement with the Pro, you've got to use Pro RAW. It definitely provides much higher quality photos, which is great for the photography enthusiasts, but of course this comes with those drawbacks we discussed earlier as well. I also mentioned in previous videos the new flash, which has greatly improved the colour consistency with the 14 series. The Pros are listed as having adaptive True Tone flash, but I didn't really see much of a difference between phones. They're both doing a great job with the flash this year. As for video recording, there's very little in it. The quality of the regular 4K video is almost exactly the same, and they can both record in the new 4K cinematic and action modes. The only difference is that the Pros can record macro video and in the ProRes format, so the latter will really only appeal to professionals. And finally, with the front camera, we have not only the same photonic engine, but the same new selfie lens as well, so it's no surprise to see that there's basically no difference in selfies or with selfie portraits. The advantage for the Pro is being able to shoot in Pro RAW on the front lens too. You can see this immediately improves the dynamic range, but photos also appear much flatter prior to editing. And as you might expect, there's not really anything to separate the front camera's video either, aside from, once again, the ProRes format. But for the vast majority of people, there's no difference. I want to stress that it's not my intention to talk down the 14 Pro. As I've said, I think it has the best overall camera system on the market right now. But I wanted to demonstrate the real-world performance and the less obvious limitations that mean when you actually come to use these phones, the 14 and 14 Plus are often just as good. I think the 14's ultra-wide lens is even better than the Pros, though I also recognise the Pro's obvious advantage in having Pro RAW and that extra telephoto lens. But ask yourself, are you willing to wait longer to take photos with the 48 megapixel lens? Are you happy using 30, even 40 times the storage? And do you want to then edit those Pro RAW photos so that they look their best? Or would you prefer to not use Pro RAW, to let Apple do the work and have instant, great-looking 12 megapixel results? Because if you're in that second camp, as most people will be, you don't really need a Pro. The 14 and 14 Plus offer this too at a lower price. That lower price is $799 for the iPhone 14 and $999 for the Pro. That's the same as last year in the US, with the bigger models each costing $100 extra. So essentially, it's $200 more to get a Pro. This list gives a summary of what you get for that, and we've already seen how small a lot of these differences actually are. With the processors, the battery life, and even the cameras, most people won't notice. I should also point out that thanks to an internal redesign, the 14 and 14 Plus are now much cheaper to repair. Just look at the price difference replacing the glass compared to the Pros. So those of you of a more clumsy disposition, you should bear this in mind too. A lot of people get instantly drawn towards those Pro iPhones and don't stop to ask if they actually need those Pro features. In fairness, this has often been because people simply wanted that bigger display with the bigger battery, but now Apple offers exactly that in the 14 Plus, so I wouldn't be surprised to see this phone become very popular. For the people who don't care about the specs and just want an iPhone with the biggest display possible, the Plus is a no-brainer. Unfortunately, this does kind of highlight the smaller iPhone 14 as the outlier now. It feels out of place, offering neither the Plus's awesome battery life and big display, nor any of the Pro features, and it isn't a big upgrade over the iPhone 13 either, so I'm not really sure who that phone is for. If there was one area in particular in the Pro iPhone's favour, it would be the display. ProMotion is a really nice feature to have, and as someone who's now used to high refresh rates and wouldn't want to go back, I completely understand those of you who will now avoid the 14 and 14 Plus for this reason alone. Realistically, Apple should have given this to the 14s as well, and they're pretty much the only company selling a smartphone this expensive without a high refresh rate. There's also Dynamic Island, which is a feature that could easily be dismissed as not worth it. But smartphones in general are so similar now. There are fewer innovations every year, so sometimes all it takes is one small feature like this to make the phone feel different, to become a lot more interesting, and therefore worth buying instead. It's kind of like what I said about Nothing's Phone 1. That design is really cool, and it made me want to buy it because it felt different, even though the rest of the phone was only pretty good. It's the same thing with Dynamic Island. It makes the phone feel modern and fresh, but in this instance I do actually find it useful as well. So there are definitely some smaller quality of life perks that only the Pros offer, and sometimes that's enough to make spending extra on them worth it. Certainly across Europe and other areas where the iPhone's got a big price hike this year, it's definitely turned me away from the 14 and 14 Plus. Now, the percentage price increase for the Pros is actually around twice as much as for the iPhone 14 here in the UK. However, it's the fact that it seems like the iPhone 14 pricing has now crossed a new threshold. You can't really see the 14 as the cheap option now. These are flagship prices, so the savings trade-off seems less worth it, and it almost feels to me like you might as well go all in and get a Pro. A £250 saving is no joke, but I personally wouldn't spend my money on a 14 or 14 Plus. I would get a Pro. Now that's because I love smartphones and use them heavily. I would feel happier even if I wasn't technically getting my money's worth. But if you're not too fussed about tech, you probably shouldn't be considering any of these new phones. There are cheaper options available. So we've essentially reached the same conclusion as last year. Do you actually need the Pro? For most people, definitely not. But with the lack of innovation with the iPhone 14 this year, and especially in those regions where the prices went up, I think the Pros are more deserving of your consideration this year than they were last year. Okay, so that just about wraps things up for the new iPhone 14s, but I'd love to hear from you guys. Which iPhone are you getting this year? If you have any questions about these phones or want some advice with upgrading, then leave a comment and we'll do our best to help you. I'll be comparing the 14 Pro Max against Samsung's S22 Ultra very soon, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel and turn notifications on so that you know when that video goes live. Please give this video a like if you found it helpful, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.